Formula One's laboured endeavours to break into the American market properly have been well documented throughout its history. In contemporary F1, having now had 8 races at the purpose-built circuit of the Americas, America now has a Formula One team, Haas, and has taken on American owners, Liberty, since 2017, and means that the tide is beginning to turn. But the stranglehold of IndyCar and NASCAR in the States is still proving difficult to break. But until Gene Haas brought his eponymous outfit to F1, the last American team to participate in F1 did so 30 years before that. The unrelated Carl Haas's outfit, running a Lola badge chassis penned by Neil Oatley and Ross Brawn, entered with backing from Beatrice Foods, and lasted for a season and a bit before its funding from the food processing concern expired. The deadlock of American manufacturers entering Formula One, having enjoyed a glut in the 60s and 70s with Eagle, Penske and Scarab, looked to have been broken sooner amid F1's new team tender process. Sensing an opportunity to increase F1's exposure in America, the FIA admitted the US F1 team to the 2010 grid in its overtures to hand the Star-Spangled Banner its first exposure on the constructors list for nearly a quarter of a decade. Set up by engineer Ken Anderson, a veteran of IndyCar, heading up the design of the G-Force car that took to the IRL's cast of oval circuits, and ex-Williams F1 team manager Peter Windsor, the US F1 project made its home in Charlotte, North Carolina, from facilities formerly owned by the Joe Gibbs Racing NASCAR team. But although the US F1 project only took to the entry list in 2009, Anderson and Windsor had been working on getting them there since the mid-2000s. Having got to know each other working at Williams in the 1980s, Anderson and Windsor showed their plans to the FIA's North American delegate Nick Kroll. The two set to work on securing investment and getting everything in place technically. US F1 had been in talks with multiple engine manufacturers as far back as 2008. But following the mass exodus after the global financial crisis, that severely restricted their options. Anderson asserts that with the US posing as some of the manufacturers' biggest markets, he was offered lucrative engine deals to help increase their pull on the other side of the Atlantic, and says that then Ferrari president Luca de Montezemolo offered him a good deal to take on the Ferrari engines. In addition, the team looked to have some solid investment from the US on board, all looking to make things happen. The most high profile of those was YouTube co-founder Chad Hurley, who along with partner Steve Chen sold the platform to Google for nearly $2 billion. Running a budget-capped F1 team then presumably looked like back-of-the-sofa money to the people on board. Although the team explored options with other manufacturers, US F1 eventually deferred to the FIA's wishes and collected a deal with Cosworth. Nonetheless, Anderson says that the eventual decision to take the neutral engine had undermined the team's previous plans, having wanted to use US F1 as a platform to help an existing manufacturer expand its presence in America. It was back to the drawing board in that case. The team had the Haas NASCAR team's wind shear wind tunnel available to it, along with a full vehicle dynamics facility to build up its engineering program. In 2009, Anderson and Windsor were in talks with drivers, including Karun Chandhok, who eventually joined HRT for its eventual stab at Formula One. Bernie Ecclestone, who had been assisting Chandhok with his endeavours to make the F1 grid, suggested that he flew over to the US to investigate the facilities and see whether the team could potentially offer him a drive for 2010. Chandhok had met with Windsor a few times prior to that and decided to see what all the fuss was about. He also served as Ecclestone's envoy to check everything was in order at the team's Charlotte base. Regardless, the team had a car dubbed the US F1 Type 1 designed and in the works. Anderson says that the first chassis was completed as of Christmas 2009 and were in the process of sorting wiring and gearboxes ahead of the season. The gearboxes were something of an anomaly in the Type 1. Although X-Track was producing its own gearboxes for the Cosworth engine, US F1 decided to build its own and went for a transverse layout. There were other peculiarities too with the design of the car, featuring coilover shock dampers instead of the torsion bar arrangement used commonly in contemporary F1. Chandhok expressed his surprise at seeing coil suspension on the Type 1, which he likens to being on an F3 car. Anderson suggested that this was a way to bring more travel into the suspension. He was also taken aback by Anderson's assertion that the ban on refueling would put more emphasis on mechanical grip and taking away some of the development from aerodynamics. Sure, the Type 1 had its quirks, but the team at least had something being produced in the facilities. The monocoque was built and US F1 launched videos on its YouTube channel, arguably ahead of its time in that facet, of the team building and crash testing a nose cone. Media attention was enough at the team for Anderson and Windsor to go on American TV in order to promote their new project. But behind the facade, the facilities at Charlotte weren't operating at full capacity. Reports of a half-empty factory were confirmed by external sources, and Chandhok attests as much when he visited the factory in November 2009. Other reports suggest that the lights were on and nobody was at home. As stories began to emerge from the US F1 camp amid suggestions that the team didn't look like it was going to be ready, Anderson says that the investors who had aligned themselves with the team began to get cold feet. With the team on the precipice of not having enough time to make it onto the grid, the sponsors slowly began to trickle away, leaving Anderson and Windsor with a bit of a hole to fill on the finance front. Some of those concerns were partially alleviated with the signing of ex-GP2 racer Jose Maria Lopez, who came with the support of the Argentine government. The team was also in the process of securing former Honda and Super Aguri test driver James Rossiter for the other seat, opting for an all-rookie lineup. But again, as finances started to dwindle and doubts around US F1's continued participation became more serious, Lopez began to get wandering eyes, and was hoping to bring a sponsorship package over to the Campos team, which was also in trouble. Although Lopez was signed in January of 2010, US F1 suppliers were also beginning to have doubts. Cosworth, now headed up by Mark Gallagher after Lola's F1 bid was turned down, was in dialogue with the teams to ensure that it could cater to all of its customers, except US F1, which proved incredibly difficult to get any vital information out of. One conversation that Gallagher recalls was enough to make him think that the US F1 entry wasn't going to go ahead, even though the team was making payments to the engine manufacturer. Cosworth asked them for information on sidepod designs, air intakes, and various other installation criteria. At the turn of the new year, Gallagher pushed Anderson on what was happening at the team, and hadn't gambled on the answer that he got. According to him, Anderson suggested that the engine was the last thing that US F1 needed to worry about. At the end of the design phase, they'd just drop it in. With F1 engines having been a stressed member since the 1960s, Gallagher thought that that was the end for the team. And Gallagher and Cosworth were right. There was radio silence from US F1 as the other new teams belatedly began to prepare and test their cars, and it became all too apparent that F1's dream to bring an American team into the mix simply wasn't going to take effect for 2010. By March, US F1 had rescinded its entry, and that was the end for the team. But Anderson suggests that if the FIA had kept its faith in the team, it could have come in midway through the season. But without the backing, US F1's time was up. A Phoenix entry headed by the Cypher Group looked to take over US F1's assets and propel it into Formula 1 for the 2011 season. But the FIA took on no teams during that second tender process, and the hopes of an American team would have to wait another 5 years. Another team attempted to purchase US F1's entry before the start of the 2010 season, having apparently got an entry together, but was also linked with a merger with another prospective entrant that had hit trouble before the season had begun. But that team, despite the financial tide and circling vultures, somehow made it to the grid at short notice. And we'll get to them next time.